Okay, so moving right along here, we're going to look at the Roman poet Catullus. And so a lot of parallels to lesson 4 here in lesson 8. We studied the Aeneid, which is very similar to the Odyssey, and now we're studying Catullus. There's a lot of parallels with Sappho. He's much like Rome's answer to Sappho, the way that Virgil was Rome's answer to Homer. And so we get to look at short lyric poetry again, but Catullus being a man rather than a woman, there's obviously a lot of differences from Sappho. So we'll talk about the similarities and the differences, and you have the opportunity to enjoy short lyric poetry again. You know, short lyric poetry is a much less accessible genre, even than narrative poetry, because we as people are so used to loving stories. And I love stories more as a next person. But if there's one thing you didn't have a passion for before this class that I hope you have now, it would be, I would hope, short lyric poetry. So a little bit about Catullus. He was born in the northern Italian city of Verona into a prominent aristocratic family of the highest social class called equestrian. So he's part of the upper class of society, as many poets were until more recent years. He made close friends and bitter enemies among his fellow aristocrats. So he kind of satirized people a little bit like Aristophanes did. He never married, but he may have had an intense love affair with the woman who inspired the Lesbia poems, who may be the aristocratic and educated Claudia Metella. So what you have here, it's really interesting with Catullus, is a sequence of poems. It's like a collection of poems. And a lot of those poems have a speaker who is devoted to a beloved, and that beloved woman is named Lesbia. So it's a very clear allusion, kind of a nod to Sappho, since she was from the island of Lesbos. And this may have been a real person. This aristocratic, educated woman, Claudia Metella, may have been the inspiration for Lesbia. We don't know. Lesbia is this invented character, so whether or not she was based on a real person, kind of up in the air. Maybe, maybe not. And even though Catullus never married, there seem to be some letters and some other things that indicate that he had a passionate relationship, an intense love affair with this Claudia Metella. But Cicero, one of Catullus's contemporaries, in his writings, he described Metella as a sexual predator, a husband killer, and a drunk. So we might start to see why it was a challenging relationship for Catullus, which, you know, as he presents in the poetry, right? It's really, the Lesbia poems are really interesting because you see a speaker who's clearly like madly in love with this woman. Perhaps I would argue too obsessed, too much fixated on her. And she's also like, doesn't reciprocate that. She's a challenging woman with whom to be in love. And so that creates a very interesting, you know, dynamic that's really interesting to study. I already mentioned how the name he made up for his beloved in the poems, Lesbia, refers to the island where Sappho lived. And in so many ways, Catullus, or Sappho, is Catullus's poetic predecessor. I mean, what he achieved, Sappho is probably more well known, but what he achieved in Rome is very similar to what Sappho achieved in ancient Greece. And there's not really another famous world poet in between them, certainly after Catullus, but not in between them. And he saw a lot during his lifetime. The rise, but not the fall, of Julius Caesar. So he saw Julius Caesar come to power, but died before Caesar did. And he lived in the last century of the Roman Republic. So, right, I said Rome was a republic before Caesar came to power in the last lecture. And so here you see how if Catullus was alive when Caesar came to power, he would have seen the end of the republic and the start of the dictatorship. So that's a lot to witness in one's lifetime. That's a lot of sweeping change. And he had a very short life. He held a position in the government and traveled to Asia Minor as part of it, but died soon after. And the textbook points out how on his trip back from Asia Minor, he stopped at his brother's tombstone and visited it and wrote, I think it's poem 101 from our collection. So that's kind of an interesting elegiac poem about death. But that's it. That's all we really know about Catullus' life. Is really minor and brief. But I think the important points to take away from this are that, he saw a lot of sweeping change in his lifetime, the shift from a republic to a dictatorship, and then he achieved poetically for the Romans on a similar scale to what Sappho achieved for the Greeks, and he intentionally alludes to her in his poetry and kind of builds on what she did before by adding some interesting twists or wrinkles to the poetic style, because what he does is very similar to what Sappho did. They both wrote about unrequited love, but Catullus gives kind of a different perspective on it. So before we look at a poem, I'm just going to go over with you again real quickly the guidelines for reading short lyric poetry, because you can't read it the same way you would read the Aeneid, right? Because it's not really telling a story, maybe a little bit, but it's more speaking about a subject. And it's really, even though it's been translated from Latin to English here, it really, because it's poetic language rather than straightforward English, sounds like a foreign language to us. So you have to treat the poetry as if it's a foreign language and really try to translate it in your own words to get the most out of it. And so once again, these are my guidelines or steps for doing that. First, I recommend you read the poem once at a normal pace to get a feel for the language. Even though the language is different and difficult and challenging compared to what you're used to, the language is very important. The poet is using this kind of language for a reason. So reading it at least once to get a feel for that language, just get a sense of it, even if you don't know what it means, that's just kind of immersing yourself in the poem that way, very important. Then, once you've done that, read it again, but more slowly, and this time out loud. So if you read slowly out loud, and I try to demonstrate this when I quote from the literature in these lectures, but if you read out loud slowly, you get a feel for the rhythm, much the way you get a feel for the language the first time through, because there'll be commas, there'll be periods, there'll be other punctuation marks, and following those guidelines, you'll pause at certain points if you're going slowly and if you're going out loud. And the poet, the author, Catullus in this case, wants you to pause at those points. And so poetry is language and it's rhythm. And so doing these two things to get a feel for both before you try to translate it is one of my biggest tips. Now, on a third time through, try to paraphrase in your own words what each line of the poem means by making notes in the margins. So we make notes in the margins when we read, but with poetry, especially these are short poems, 8, 10, 12, 14 lines, they're not very long. Try to jot down what you think the line means. You might be wrong. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just what you think it means. And since it's your third time through, hopefully you'll be starting to get a feel for what it means. And kind of going slowly and doing this line by line will really force you to actually, like I said, translate it, put it in more standard English, get it what it means. So once you've done this, once you've paraphrased all the lines, go through and read your paraphrase of the poem. So read it and just read it in kind of your standard or modern English and see if you'll understand what it means then. And so you'll get the meaning of it that time. So that's your fourth time through. Now, read it at least one more time, a fifth time, again, out loud slowly, but after reading your paraphrase. So you've felt the language, you felt the rhythm, you've struggled through to get the meaning, you think you know what it means. Now, with all of that in mind, one more time out loud slowly, because then you'll have language, rhythm, and meaning, all three parts of it. And that'll be, then you've read it. So to read the Aeneid, you can just sit and read it and take some notes. To read poetry, you got to do this to get it. And then once you've done that, try to sum up the entire poem in just a few sentences to get a sense of its unity, because you've paraphrased line by line. So you know what each line means, but put it together. What does it all mean? So if I said, take poem number 8 or poem number 1, and in 2 sentences, tell me what it's about. You can't go line by line because that's more than 2 sentences. So what you've done up to this point is force you to kind of look at it piece by piece and try to put it together. Now I'm asking you to finish putting it together. What does it mean as a whole? And finally, you think about what is significant or meaningful about the message of this poem. So anytime we read literature, we need to think about this. Like with the Aeneid, I'd ask you this. And what might it be? Would it be with the Aeneid, maybe the portrayal of Dido presents femininity in a new or unique way? Or maybe it offers a really compelling critique of imperialism. And that's an important thing for us to know, because imperialism is problematic. It's bad. So similarly, once you've got the unity of the poem, you know what it means. The next but also last and final question is, after what does it all mean, is why does it matter? And you've got to answer that. I haven't picked these readings at random. I believe everything we've read in this class is important and that we can all learn from it, and our minds can grow by reading these things. And so if we don't ask, so what? If we don't ask, why the heck did Professor Hohner choose this, and try to answer that question, we're not maximizing our reading. We're not getting as much out of the reading of the poetry as we can. So real quickly, I'm going to go over some themes of Catullus' poetry. There's different ways to approach poetry. So with the Hymn to the Grade of 10 and the Psalms from the Hebrew Bible and Sappho, I did basically what I just described and took you through line by line with a poem. It seems after seeing this many examples, we've got that down. And so what I'm going to try to do here is we will go through one poem line by line, but I want to give you a little bit more than that to go on. And so I've come up with a list of themes here, which is a concept we really started to study with the Iliad. What is a theme? And this will be going to give you some guidelines. Like as you now pour through Catullus' poetry and try to interpret it, having in mind these things might be really helpful. So one really important thing to remember before we look at these different themes is the dramatic situation. Every poem has a dramatic situation, which means there's a speaker and a listener. So there's someone who is speaking or talking and someone who's supposed to be listening. Now, the speaker is not necessarily the poet. In these poems, Catullus uses his own name. So we can almost infer that the author is the speaker. But a crucial misstep in studying poetry is to always assume that the speaker and the author are the same person. Even here, Catullus might be calling the speaker Catullus, but that doesn't necessarily mean he wants readers to think it's him. Similarly, the listener is not always you, the reader. The speaker of the poem might be speaking to someone else in the poem. Now, Catullus kind of plays with this because he does often kind of address the audience, but usually within the poem itself, there's a listener. So you got to remember that there's the speaker, the listener, in every poem. And Catullus adds another layer here that's not always true in every poem, where there's a beloved. Here he's devoted not all, but many of his poems to this fictional made-up woman who may have been based on a real person who he calls Lesbia. And the beloved is usually not always a real person, although often loosely based on a real person. So a speaker, not necessarily the poet, a listener, not necessarily us, but someone in the poem, and a beloved, not always a real person, but often very loosely based on one. And so these are the three aspects of a dramatic situation of a poem. And every single poem has a speaker and a listener. Not every poem has a beloved. Not every Catullus poem has a beloved, but all the Lesbia poems do. And those are the most famous ones. So what are the themes now? Again, pietas or duty. Catullus often feels very compelled to do things. And in his relationship with Lesbia kind of represents that or complicates that. It depends on the poem, but you can see a parallel here to Aeneas and Dido. Distance, so between time periods, moments, people, one person and himself. The speaker here is often very conflicted. There's also distance between him and lesbia. He speaks about earlier periods of time. So distance in many forms is an important theme. Connection is the antithesis to distance. So, the speaker wants more than anything to have a connection to lesbia, which he doesn't have. And so distance and connection work jointly as themes in that sense. Betrayal is what ruptures connection, and many of these poems feature betrayal. The relationship specifically to the reader. So like I said, the listener is usually not the reader in a poem. It's usually someone who's actually exists within the poem. And here that's still true. But what's interesting is Catullus presents it in a very interesting way, like almost like we're eavesdropping. Like he's kind of the reader is the listener, or like a secondary listener, and he kind of wants us to pick up on some things. It's a very unique kind of twist you don't see in a lot of poetry. Psychology. So in the way the speaker talks about lesbia, you learn a lot about the speaker's state of mind, but you don't learn very much about lesbia. So a typical kind of mistake to make when someone is reading a style of poetry that has a beloved like these poems is to assume that the poems are devoted to about the beloved. No, they're really very self-focused. They're really very focused on the speaker, and the beloved is just kind of a tool to explore the psychology of the speaker. And this specific thing was the beginning of a tradition, the poet devoting a sequence of poems to an unattainable beloved that tells the story of their romance. So this is not narrative poetry like Gilgamesh and the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid. But if you put all of the lesbia poems in order, even though each one tells its own individual thing and they're not really narratives, if you put all the lesbia poems together, they do kind of tell the story of the speaker and lesbia's romance. And so this is what we call a sequence of poems, like they're sequential, and they're devoted to a beloved. That beloved's unattainable. He does not get to have or possess lesbia the way he wants to. And putting the sequence together it's not quite a story the way we think of a story, but it does tell a bit of a narrative. This was eventually adapted by another Italian poet very much later in the 14th century named Petrarch. And then Shakespeare and other English writers adapted it from Petrarch and invented what we know today as the sonnet, which is the most common poetic form. And you can see the origins not of the form, but of the content of the form, the sonnet, in Catullus' poetry. So that's, really interesting. All right, let's take a look at poem 8. And again, we've really practiced going through line by line, so I'm not going to do that now. But I'm going to read the poem in its entirety, and then I'm going to pose 3 questions to you that I think are really interesting and really get at the heart of this poem, and will give you some fun things to think about before we transition to the discussion board. Wretched Catullus, you have to stop this nonsense. Admit that what you see has ended is over. Once there were days which shone for you with rare brightness, when you would follow wherever your lady led you, the one we once loved as we will love no other. There was no end in those days to our pleasures, when what you wished for was what she also wanted. Yes, there were days which shone for you with rare brightness. Now she no longer wishes. You mustn't. You've got to stop chasing her now. Cut your losses. Harden your heart and hold out firmly against her. Goodbye now, lady. Catullus' heart is hardened. He will not look to you, nor call against your wishes. How you'll regret it when nobody comes calling. So much for you, bitch. Your life is all behind you. Now, who will come to see you, thinking you lovely? Whom will you love now, and whom will you belong to? Whom will you kiss, and whose lips will you nibble? But you, Catullus, you must hold out now firmly. So reason I picked this poem, I think it's fascinating. Of all the poems, this was the most interesting one to me. But the reason I picked it, the reason it was interesting to me, is that he starts off by saying, "Wretched Catullus." Again, we can't assume the speaker is the same as the author, but in this case, the speaker has the same name as the author. And what's interesting is he's talking to himself. And a few lines down, he even uses the word "we." So it's almost like a split personality or something. But I find it fascinating that he's talking to himself. And so if Catullus is poetry, the way it's foundational and influential eventually to Renaissance poetry later on, if this is all about the speaker's state of mind, what does it tell us here? That it's almost like split personalities? I don't know, but he's talking to himself and he's using a plural first person pronoun "we." That's really interesting. Most poems, like I said, have a speaker and a listener, but no one other than the speaker is present in the dramatic situation of this poem. In other words, there's not a clear listener. So the speaker could be both speaker and listener, or you, the reader, could be the listener. Do you feel like Catullus is speaking directly to you in this poem? If so, what effect does that have on you? Why would he choose this approach? So there's a few possibilities. It could also be like split or multiple personalities, where Catullus 1 and 2, for instance, are the speaker and the listener. He's talking to himself. So even if we don't think it's split personalities, the speaker and the listener could be the same person. We all talk to ourselves at various times. Or the reader could be the listener, which I said doesn't often happen, but sometimes does. And I mentioned some of the poems kind of make us feel like we're eavesdropping, like we're kind of privy to something we shouldn't be. He's giving us a glimpse in. So there's a few different ways to interpret this, kind of building on the first question of talking to himself, what do you think of that? Now, why is he doing that? Well, here, the dramatic situation, that context of speaker and listener, we see the importance of thinking about that when we read poetry. Finally, how does the poem use the literary or poetic device of irony? Do you believe what Catullus is saying? Why does he repeat the same thing so many times? How could writing a poem like this be helpful or cathartic to someone going through a difficult breakup? So, again, building on question 2, in question 2, I ask, why is he talking to himself? Why choose this approach? Here, I'm asking more questions to offer why. This poem seems to be about moving on from a breakup, but he's convincing himself. He's like, Catullus, you got to do with it. You got to cut your losses. You got to stick to it. And it's almost like that situation. I know you're all familiar with this, or this has happened to you, where you're talking to someone and they keep saying the same thing over and over again, but you get the impression they don't quite believe it. They wouldn't be saying it so many times. If they really believed it, they just say it once. But it's like each extra time they say it, they're trying to convince themselves of it. So I think he's trying to convince himself to move on from this woman who's broken his heart, but he's not quite able to do it yet. And that could account for the split personality, the psychological trauma, etc. But what's interesting is, even though I would offer here, it might be ironic in another way, even though he seems ironically unable to move on from this woman because he's trying so hard to convince himself of it, the act of writing the poem for Catullus, the man, the poet, if this was something he was going through at the time, that might actually help him move on from the real woman in real life. Because one thing I've learned over the years is that writing is an incredibly helpful way to mend a wounded heart. There's something cathartic about it. Remember from studying drama, the purging of emotions? If a relationship is over and you can't move on, or you can never have that feeling with that person again, and you have to move on, but you just can't seem to do it, there's all kinds of emotions wrapped up in that. And so writing about it might actually kind of push someone to move on, to achieve that, because you get to purge those emotions through the act of writing. So even Catullus, the speaker here, is unable to convince himself. Maybe the act of writing is actually helpful to Catullus, the real man, the author, the writer. Just an idea I have. It's not proven. It's something I'm trying to support with textual evidence. I'll be very curious to see what you think. Finally, the discussion board questions. So as with the other examples of short poetry we've read, you can give me or in your classmates on the discussion board, your summary. You don't have to do every line because that'd probably be more than 250 words. But you do have to hit 250 words. So you probably have to give more than your 2 sentences of unity. So, a few sentences on the unity and then whatever more you want to add, particularly getting at what is significant or meaningful. Like with that last poem, I really think as difficult as it is for the speaker in that poem to mend his wounded heart, I think it might have been helpful for the writer, and I think it might be helpful for the reader, for us. If we are struggling to move on, we can kind of see what Catullus is working through. And so explaining what a poem means and then explaining why it's important, that's easily 250 words. You can just pick any of the poems and do that. But I know some of you would prefer to have a prompt, something to kind of guide you to thinking about what to write about. And so I have 3 questions about 3 other poems. Well, one of them is that poem. In poem 8, Catullus tries to convince himself to move on after a breakup. Based on the content of the poem, do you think you'll be able to do this? So I've already addressed this, but like I said, I want to know what you think. And when you address it, don't forget about irony. Poem 64 is what we call an epyllion or a mini epic. So this one is longer than all the other poems. And if a long narrative poem like Gilgamesh or the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Aeneid is like a novel, then this epyllion, poem 64, is like a mini epic. And it addresses some of what happened in the Iliad. It's depicting the marriage of Achilles' parents. So it's kind of sweet and romantic in that sense, and kind of fits with the rest of Catullus's poetry in that sense, but it's complicated. Even though it's about a wedding of Achilles' parents, there is some bleak imagery in there, dark imagery in there as well. So how does this kind of revisit the Iliad and kind of put a new twist on it? And finally, poem 101 is that one I mentioned about him visiting his brother's grave. So you could take on that poem and address the theme of grief. Like, how does he deal with grief? And I would consider, you don't have to actually compare it in your discussion board post, but at least in your thought processes, compare it to poem 8 or any of the other lesbian poems or any of the other romantic poems. If a poem like poem 8 is helping a speaker or a writer or even a reader deal with a wounded heart, how does a poem like 101, maybe using some similar tactics but a different subject matter, help a speaker or even a writer or even a reader deal with, rather than a wounded heart, helping them deal with grief, loss, tragedy, the loss of a loved one? So some kind of surprisingly powerful poetry from a poet who seemed, very fixated on one woman, but gives us something in all 3 of these examples and others that's, really interesting and compelling. So as always, very excited to hear what you think on the discussion board, and I hope that after Sappho and Catullus, you now love lyric poetry and you're going to go out and read Emily Dickinson and every short poem you never wanted to read before that you can get your hands on.